The first shot hit Ambassador Dara Osei in the chest, before any of us understood what was happening. I saw it from 12 meters away. I was standing in the upper gallery of the Galactic Conclave chamber, with my right hand resting on the grip of my sidearm, and my left hand holding a data pad that displayed the legal brief Osei was delivering to the assembled delegates. The brief was 40 pages long. She was on page 11. She never made it to page 12. My name is Elias Varro. I was the Deputy Security Chief of the Human Diplomatic Mission to the Galactic Conclave, and I am telling you this story because 7 people who should be telling it instead are lying in graves on a planet that most of the galaxy has never heard of. I am telling it because someone has to, and because the truth of what happened in that chamber deserves better than the silence it almost received. The trouble began months before the massacre, with a document called Resolution 3117. If you have not heard of it, that is because the Conclave buried it under so many layers of diplomatic language that even experienced politicians needed 3 readings to understand what it actually demanded. Stripped of the formalities and the careful phrasing, the resolution was simple. It demanded that humanity surrender independent command of its entire fleet to a council-appointed overseer, not a joint command structure, not a cooperative framework with shared authority. A single alien official, chosen by a vote in which humans had no participation, who would control where our ships went, when they deployed, what weapons they carried, and what orders they followed. Every human vessel, from the deep space carriers that patrolled the outer boundaries to the system patrol craft that guarded our colonies, would answer to someone who was not human, who had not been elected by humans, and who owed no loyalty to human interests. The resolution had been engineered by one person. Sothar, the Velith speaker of the Conclave, had spent the better part of a year building support for it among the other member species. The Velith were the oldest and most politically powerful civilization in the Conclave, and Sothar had used that influence with surgical precision. He had visited delegations privately. He had offered trade concessions. He had made promises about future resolutions that would benefit species who supported this one. And at the core of every conversation, he had planted the same seed of fear. Humanity's fleet was growing too fast. Humanity's reach was extending too far. And if the galaxy did not act now to contain this expansion, it would be too late. It was a lie, of course. Humanity's fleet was large, but it was not aggressive. Our ships patrolled our own territory and our own trade lanes. We had never fired on a Conclave vessel. We had never threatened a member species. We had never violated a single article of the Conclave Charter. But fear does not require facts. It only requires a voice willing to speak it loudly enough, and often enough. And Sothar had been speaking for a very long time. Ambassador Osei had spent 3 months preparing our response. She was a small woman, with dark skin and close-cropped gray hair, and a voice that could fill a room without ever rising above conversational volume. She had been a diplomat for 26 years, and she understood the Conclave's legal framework better than most of the aliens who had built it. When she stood at the central podium in the Great Chamber, surrounded by the tiered seating of 14 alien delegations, she was not nervous. She was not angry. She was precise. She rejected Resolution 3117 on legal grounds. She cited the Sovereign Charter, the founding document of the Conclave itself, which guaranteed every member species the absolute and inalienable right to maintain independent military command. She cited 7 separate precedents where other species had invoked the same clause under similar circumstances and been upheld by the Conclave's own judicial body. She explained, with the patience of a teacher addressing a classroom, that the resolution as written violated the fundamental principles on which the Conclave had been established 4 centuries ago. She was right. She was correct on every point of law and every point of precedent, and it did not matter at all. I had been watching Sothar the entire time she spoke. He sat at the center of the high bench, elevated above the rest of the chamber on a platform designed to project authority and command. His long gray face was perfectly still. His flat black eyes tracked Osei's movements at the podium without blinking. His 4-fingered hands were folded in front of him in a posture that I had initially mistaken for patience, but now recognized as anticipation. He had the look of a predator watching prey walk into a clearing, already knowing where the trap was set. When Osei finished her legal argument, and formally declined the resolution on behalf of humanity, Sothar did not pause for deliberation. He did not open the floor for discussion. He did not consult the other delegations or invite counter-arguments, or follow any of the procedural steps that the conclave's own rules required. He simply called for an immediate enforcement vote, bypassing debate entirely. 12 of the 14 member species voted in favor of enforcement. The two abstentions were the Drenai and the Corvani. I remember the Drenai ambassador, a tall being with mottled brown skin and large sorrowful eyes, lowering his gaze as the vote was tallied. He looked like a man watching a building collapse and knowing he had warned about the cracks in the foundation. Sothar announced the result and ordered humanity to comply within one solar cycle. Ose did not flinch. She stood at the podium, and she invoked the Sovereign Charter Clause directly, formally, on the record, as was her legal right under the conclave's own founding documents. The chamber went completely silent. Every delegation knew what that clause meant. It was supposed to be untouchable. It was supposed to be the one thing in the entire 400-year history of the conclave that no speaker, no majority, no political coalition could override. Sothar declared the clause void by majority vote. I felt the blood leave my face. My grip tightened on my sidearm. Beside me in the gallery, Graham Holt, one of our Marine security guards, whispered a single profanity under his breath. In the chamber below, I could see the faces of the other delegations, and on several of them, I saw the same shock that I was feeling. The Drenai ambassador had gone rigid in his seat. The Corvani delegate was gripping the armrests of her chair so hard that her claws had left marks in the material. Even some of the species who had voted with Sothar looked uncomfortable, as though they had agreed to a course of action without fully understanding how far the speaker intended to take it. OCA saw it too. She was experienced enough to read a room, and what she read in that chamber was fear. Not fear of humanity, fear of Sothar, fear of what he was willing to do to maintain control. She held her ground at the podium and stated clearly, for the record, that she would not leave until the legal challenge was formally processed through the conclave's judicial system. She was calm, she was following procedure, she was doing everything right. That was when Sothar gave the signal. I did not see the signal itself. It could have been a word, a gesture, a flicker of movement too subtle for me to catch from the gallery. It did not matter what form it took. What mattered was that the Velith shock troopers, 16 of them stationed around the perimeter of the chamber, in positions that I now realized had been chosen for maximum coverage of the human delegation, began to move. They raised their plasma carbines. Those weapons were supposed to be ceremonial, display pieces carried for tradition rather than function. They were not. They had been loaded with live plasma charges, and their power cells were at full capacity. I know this because the forensic analysis conducted after the fact confirmed that every weapon in that chamber had been charged and loaded before the session began. Before Osei even walked into the room, before the vote, before the legal arguments, before any of it. Sothar had planned this from the beginning. The first trooper fired at Osei from 6 meters away. The plasma bolt struck her in the center of her chest, and she collapsed instantly, her body hitting the stone floor with a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. She did not cry out. She did not have time. I was already moving. Training took over. The kind of deep pattern reaction that years of security work build into your muscles and your nervous system, until conscious thought becomes unnecessary. I vaulted over the gallery railing and dropped 3 meters to the main chamber level, drawing my sidearm as I fell. I heard the second and third shots before I hit the ground. Sophie Grant, our cultural liaison, took a plasma bolt in her shoulder that spun her sideways and slammed her into the wall behind the delegation seating. Peter Calloway, the youngest member of our team at 24 years old, was hit twice in the back. As he turned to shield her, he fell across her body, and neither of them moved again. I came up from my landing in a combat crouch, sighted the nearest Velith trooper, and fired twice. Both rounds hit center mass, and he went down. I shifted aim, found a second trooper, who was swinging his carbine toward Lena Park, one of our senior aides, and dropped him with a single shot. Lena had thrown herself behind a stone column and was dragging a wounded attaché named Carol Dunn across the floor by the collar of her jacket, leaving a smear of blood on the tiles. The chamber was chaos, and it was not chaos. The troopers were not firing randomly. They had specific targets. specific firing lanes, specific positions. They were executing a plan, and the plan was to eliminate every human in the room. The alien delegations were not in danger, and they knew it, because none of them moved, none of them ducked, none of them ran for the exits. They sat in their seats and watched. It lasted 90 seconds. I have reviewed the timestamp data from my ocular implant recording, and from the first shot to the last, 93 seconds elapsed. In that time, 7 humans died. Dara Osei, Sophie Grant, Peter Calloway, Carol Dunn, 2 junior communications officers named Louis Ashby and Grace Fenton, and Daniel Farrow, our lead signals technician, who had been standing near the main entrance and never saw the shot that came from behind him. I had a plasma graze across my jaw that had taken a strip of skin from my ear to my chin. The burn was deep enough to scar and shallow enough to leave me conscious. My sidearm was empty. I had fired 6 rounds and hit 4 targets, and the magazine was dry. Graham Holt had dropped from the gallery behind me and was crouched against the base of the podium with his own weapon drawn, covering my flank. Lena Park was behind the column with Carol Dunn, but Carol was not breathing, and Lena's arm was soaked with blood that was not her own. The surviving troopers surrounded us. I let them take my weapon because I had no rounds left, and because dying in that chamber would accomplish nothing except adding an 8th name to the list of the dead. But before they closed the distance, before they put their hands on me, I did the one thing that mattered more than anything else I have ever done. I activated my comm implant. Every member of the human diplomatic security team carried a subcutaneous communication implant embedded in the jawbone and linked to a burst transmitter that could punch a compressed data packet through short-range jamming systems and bounce it off the nearest Allied relay satellite. It was a last resort system designed for exactly this scenario, for the moment when everything had gone wrong, and the only thing left was getting the truth out. I had 9 seconds. That was the window before the Velith jamming net detected the transmission signature and shut it down. 9 seconds to compress and transmit every piece of evidence I had. In those 9 seconds, my implant sent everything. The complete ocular feed recording of the massacre, from the first shot to the last, captured in high definition through my own eyes. Biometric data pulled from the diplomatic team's medical monitors, confirming 7 deaths and their exact times. The chamber's ambient audio, including every word Sothar had spoken, and the unmistakable sound of his signal being given. And on the emergency text channel, 3 words that would be received simultaneously by every human military installation within 3 sectors. Conclave killed ours. The Velith troopers grabbed me. They slammed me face first into the floor, and the impact reopened the plasma burn on my jaw and sent a bolt of pain through my skull that whited out my vision for 2 full seconds. They put restraints on my wrists, the hard-edged kind that bit into the skin and tightened with every movement. I did not resist. The signal was already gone, already racing through subspace toward human territory at speeds that the Velith jamming net could not intercept. 9 seconds of truth, unedited and undeniable, carrying the evidence of what had happened in this chamber to every corner of human civilization. They dragged me through the service corridors of the station. Lena Park was behind me, her face white, her left arm hanging at an angle that suggested a fracture from when she had been thrown to the ground. Graham Holt was behind her, his collarbone broken, walking upright through sheer stubbornness and the kind of controlled fury that comes from watching friends die and being unable to stop it. They threw us into a detention block on the station's lower levels. 3 cells, bare metal walls, recycled air that tasted like copper and old machinery. Each cell had a narrow viewport in its door, and through mine, if I pressed my face against the glass at the correct angle, I could see down into the main gallery, and beyond it, the edge of the chamber floor. The bloodstains were still there. Nobody had cleaned them. Alien officials walked past them on their way to other business, stepping around the dark marks on the stone, as though they were a minor inconvenience rather than the remains of 7 murdered human beings. I stood at that viewport for hours. The plasma burn on my jaw bled through the field dressing I had pressed against it, and the pain was constant, a hot, pulsing rhythm that kept me focused when exhaustion pulled at the edges of my consciousness. I thought about Dara Osei. I thought about the way she had stood at that podium with her back straight and her voice calm, and her absolute unshakable belief that law and reason, and the rules that civilized beings agreed to follow would protect her. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, and I looked down at the bloodstains on the chamber floor, and I thought one thing, clearly and without anger, with the cold certainty of a man who understood exactly what his species was capable of when it was wounded. They have no idea what they just started. 11 days passed before the universe outside my cell began to change. 11 days of bare metal walls and recycled air and silence, so complete that it pressed against my eardrums like deep water. No charges were filed against us. No legal process was initiated. No communication was permitted. The Velith guards who brought meals twice a day treated us with the detached efficiency of maintenance workers servicing equipment. No words beyond the necessary. No acknowledgement that we were people rather than problems being stored until someone decided what to do with us. I spent those days trapped inside my own head, and my head was not a kind place to be. My ocular implant had recorded the massacre in perfect clarity, and my brain replayed it without permission or pause. Every time I closed my eyes, the loop began again. The first shot, Osei falling, Calloway hit in the back, the faces in the gallery, watching, motionless. I could not turn it off. I could not look away from images that existed behind my own eyelids. After the fourth day, I stopped trying to sleep in the dark and instead slept with my face pressed against the viewport, where the ambient light from the corridor gave my mind something else to hold on to. On the third day, Lena Park tapped a message through the wall between our cells, using a rhythm code from our diplomatic security training manual. Short patterns of knuckles against metal, each combination representing a letter. She asked if I was injured. I tapped back that I was functional. She tapped back 2 words that I have never forgotten. Signal sent. I tapped once. Yes. She did not tap anything else after that. She did not need to. We both understood what that signal meant, and where it was going, and what would follow. All we could do was wait in our metal boxes and trust that the machinery we had set in motion was doing its work in spaces we could not see. While I waited, Sotar went to work rewriting history. I learned the details much later, but the Velith propaganda operation began within hours of the massacre. Sothar stood before the remaining conclave delegations and delivered a formal account of the incident that bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred. In his version, the human delegation had drawn weapons first. Ambassador Osei had threatened violence when the enforcement vote was announced. The Velith shock troopers had responded in lawful self-defense against an armed and hostile diplomatic party that had violated every protocol of the chamber. He presented security footage to support this account. The footage had been edited. The first 31 seconds of the attack had been removed, the period during which his troopers opened fire on unarmed diplomats who were standing still at their stations. The edited version began at the moment I drew my sidearm, and without the preceding context, it looked exactly like what Sotar claimed, a human security officer initiating violence in the conclave chamber. Several species endorsed this version immediately. The Torvathi released a public statement calling the human delegation reckless and provocative. The Ashiri expressed regret at the loss of life, but affirmed the conclave's sovereign right to maintain order within its own chambers. The Peldrani said nothing at all, which in the coded language of conclave politics was indistinguishable from agreement. 3 species refused to endorse the narrative. The Drenai maintained a pointed silence that carried more weight than any statement could have. The Korvani released a brief communication noting inconsistencies in the official account without specifying what those inconsistencies were. And the Nelvori, a small aquatic civilization whose ambassador had reportedly left the chamber during the massacre and refused to return, withdrew their delegation to their embassy level and locked the doors. On the 6th day, a Velith intelligence officer came to my cell. He was tall, even for his species, with the uniform gray skin and flat black eyes that made every Velith look as though they had been carved from the same piece of cold stone. He carried himself with the composed authority of someone who was accustomed to being feared, and he placed a recording device on the narrow shelf that served as my table with the careful precision of a man setting a trap. He told me what I was going to do. I was going to record a statement supporting the conclave's official account. I was going to confirm that Ambassador Osei had provoked the confrontation. I was going to acknowledge that the Velith security response was lawful and justified, and I was going to express regret for my own actions in firing upon Conclave military personnel. He delivered this list of demands without inflection, as though he were reading a maintenance schedule. I looked at him across the narrow cell. The plasma burn on my jaw had begun to scar by then, the tissue pulling tight and numb along the line where the bolt had grazed me. I could feel it when I spoke, a tugging sensation that reminded me with every word of why I was in that cell and who had put me there. I said no. The intelligence officer informed me that refusal would result in my execution. He explained, in the same flat tone, that humans who attacked Conclave military personnel were subject to capital punishment under emergency security protocols that Sotar had enacted 2 days after the massacre. My trial would be brief. The evidence would be the edited footage. The sentence would be carried out within the hour. I smiled at him. It was the first time I had smiled in 11 days, and the expression pulled at the scar tissue on my jaw and sent a sharp spike of pain across my face. But I smiled anyway, because I had just realized something that the intelligence officer standing across from me did not know. I said, "You should check your long-range sensors." He stared at me. I held his gaze. After a long moment, he picked up his recording device and left the cell without speaking, the door sealed behind him. 2 hours later, the alarms began. The first alarm was a short, sharp tone, repeating every 4 seconds. I recognized it from the station emergency protocol documents I had studied during my security briefing before the diplomatic mission. It was a proximity alert, the kind that activated when an unidentified contact entered weapons range of the station. The station had never made this sound before, because in 400 years of operation, no one had ever been close enough or bold enough to trigger it. The second alarm started 30 seconds later, layered on top of the first. A long, rising wail that vibrated through the metal walls and floor and made the air itself seem to hum. Fleet-scale mobilization. Every military vessel within range ordered to power up weapons systems and prepare for engagement. Both alarms ran simultaneously for 7 minutes before they were manually silenced. Then the silence returned, but it was different now. It was not the silence of an empty corridor. It was the silence of 100,000 beings holding their breath and listening for something they could not yet hear, but knew was coming. I lay back on my cot and closed my eyes and listened to the station, trying to pretend that the universe had not just shifted beneath its foundations. Here is what had happened during those 11 days while I sat in a metal box and counted the hours. My burst transmission reached the nearest human military relay satellite in 14 minutes. The relay boosted the signal and forwarded it through the priority command network, a chain of encrypted faster-than-light communication nodes that connected every fleet installation in 3 sectors. Within 2 hours, my 9-second recording of the massacre was sitting in the secure files of every flag officer in the human navy. Admiral Katrin Soline, commanding officer of the 9th Expeditionary Group, received the transmission aboard her fleet carrier in a sector called the Vordain Reach, 3 hard days of travel from Conclave space. She watched the recording in her private briefing room, with the door locked, and her chief of staff and senior intelligence officer waiting in the corridor outside. She watched it once. She watched it again. She watched it a 3rd time with her fleet legal advisor sitting beside her, both of them silent, both of them watching the 9 seconds of footage that showed diplomats being murdered in the most sacred political chamber in the galaxy. When the recording ended for the 3rd time, Admiral Soline sent it to Fleet Command on Earth, with a single-line annotation in the message field. Recommend full activation. Full activation, 2 words that unlocked a file that had been sealed in the deepest vault of human military planning for 9 years. A contingency document written by strategists whose job was to imagine the worst and prepare for it. They had been given one question to answer: what does humanity do if a galactic power structure deliberately targets our diplomats or our civilians? The answer they had produced was called Operation Redline, and it was 300 pages long, and every single page was a step-by-step blueprint for making the attacker wish they had never been born. Within 6 hours of the transmission reaching Earth, every human military asset in 3 sectors went to silent running. Communication buoys powered down. Patrol routes were abandoned mid-circuit. Trade convoy escorts vanished from their assigned shipping lanes without filing course changes or departure notices. Diplomatic channels went unanswered. Military frequencies went dead. The entire human presence in the galactic community, hundreds of ships, dozens of stations, thousands of personnel, simply stopped communicating. The effect was not immediately obvious. The galaxy is large, and it takes time for absence to register as signal rather than coincidence. A trade partner notices that a scheduled cargo delivery does not arrive. A diplomatic office notices that a routine communication goes unanswered. A border patrol notes that the human ships that normally transit through their sector have not been detected for several days. Each incident, taken alone, seems like a minor disruption. Taken together, they form a pattern that is unmistakable. It took the Velith Intelligence Service 4 days to compile a report confirming the full scope of what had happened. Every known human military installation had gone silent. Trade vessels registered to human companies had departed from alien ports across the galaxy during a single night cycle. Over 200 ships detaching from docking clamps and burning for open space, without filing flight plans, without requesting clearance, without sending farewell messages to their port authorities. The ships simply powered up, disconnected, and disappeared into the dark. Sothar received this report on the 8th day after the massacre. According to witnesses who were present, he read it at his private desk, set it aside without visible reaction, and continued his morning correspondence as though it were a report on weather patterns in a system he had never visited. The Draenei ambassador, whose intelligence capabilities were considerably more sophisticated than the Velith wanted to acknowledge, requested a private meeting with Sothar the following morning. The meeting lasted 30 minutes, and what the Draenei ambassador said during that time was later reconstructed from notes found in his personal files after the war. He told Sothar that human silence was not retreat. He told him that in the Draenei's long history of interaction with humanity, they had observed a consistent and reliable pattern. Humans who were angry raised their voices. Humans who were grieving withdrew to mourn. But humans who were planning said nothing at all. They went quiet. They disappeared from sight. And when they returned with the kind of focused, systematic precision that left no room for negotiation or mercy. He urged Sothar to open communications immediately, to offer reparations, to acknowledge wrongdoing, to do whatever was necessary to start a dialogue before the window for diplomacy closed permanently and irrevocably. Sothar dismissed him. Humans were a young species, he said. They had overextended their influence and were now retreating to their core territory to process the shock of discovering that the galaxy was ruled by older and stronger civilizations than their own. They would mourn their dead, they would absorb the lesson, and in time, they would accept the reality of conclave authority, because that was how power had always worked. The strong set the terms. The weak accepted them. The Draenei ambassador left the meeting and immediately began drafting contingency plans for his own species. He understood what Sothar did not, that the silence spreading across human space was not the quiet of defeat. It was the quiet of a weapon being aimed. On the 11th morning of my detention, the proximity alarms screamed to life and did not stop. Through my viewport, I could see station personnel running in the corridors. Velith military officers shouted orders in their clipped syllables. Maintenance crews sealed blast doors that had not been closed in decades. The station's tactical display, visible on a public screen at the end of my corridor, showed contacts appearing at the edge of sensor range. 1, then 3, then 12. Then the display flickered and went dark, and replaced itself with a simple text notification in Velith that translated roughly as, "Sensor calibration failure, signal integrity compromised." They could not count the contacts because there were too many of them, arriving from too many directions, moving in patterns that the station's tracking algorithms had never been designed to process. Human ships, running dark, emerging from positions that the Conclave had never mapped, in numbers that the Conclave's own intelligence assessments had insisted were impossible. I lay on my cot and listened to the alarms wail, and I felt something shift inside my chest. It was not relief, it was not joy, it was not even satisfaction. It was the sensation of a mechanism engaging, a lock turning, the first movement of something vast and precise and utterly without mercy beginning to unfold. I closed my eyes. There it is, I thought. There it is. I counted the alarm cycles for 47 minutes before they cut out, and were replaced by a silence heavier than anything I had experienced in 11 days of solitary confinement. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor, and they were not Velith footsteps. They were human boots on metal decking, 4 sets of them, moving in tactical formation, fast and quiet and precise. The lock on my cell door blew inward with a shaped breaching charge that produced no more noise than a firm cough. The door swung open, and a woman in black tactical gear stepped through with a suppressed rifle at her shoulder and a heads-up display glowing green across her visor. She swept the cell in a single practiced motion, confirmed I was the only occupant, and lowered her weapon. "Commander Varro," she said. "Lieutenant Commander Kira Donovan, Special Operations. We are here to bring you home." I stood. My legs were unsteady from 11 days of limited movement and inadequate nutrition, and the scar on my jaw pulled when I moved my head too quickly. I looked at Donovan and her 3-person extraction team and said the only thing that mattered: Lena Park and Graham Holt, 2 cells down the corridor, both alive. Donovan nodded once. 2 operators peeled off without a word and moved down the corridor toward the other cells. I heard the muffled thud of 2 more breaching charges, and then Lena's voice, hoarse from disuse but strong underneath it, asking the question I would have asked in her position. "How did you get in here?" Donovan answered while handing me a field medical kit and a sealed datapad. "Maintenance shaft," she said. "The Conclave ran a service tunnel through the station's lower hull during a structural refit 11 years ago. They sealed it afterward and removed it from their active infrastructure maps. We kept it on ours. We moved through that shaft in single file, 4 operators and 3 former prisoners, crawling through a tube barely wide enough for shoulders in tactical gear. The air smelled like coolant and old insulation. Donovan's team had mapped every junction, every access hatch, every turn in advance, and they moved through the station's internal architecture with the fluid confidence of people who had rehearsed this extraction so many times that their muscles knew the route independent of conscious thought. 7 minutes after the cell doors blew, we were inside a stealth shuttle docked against the station's outer hull in a sensor blind spot between 2 detection arrays. The pilot, a young officer named Marcus Webb, engaged the engines before the inner airlock had fully sealed, and we accelerated away from the station hard enough to press me deep into my seat restraints and make my vision narrow at the edges. No shots fired, no alarms triggered until we were already 3,000 kilometers out and accelerating into open space on a vector that no Conclave tracking system was equipped to follow. Donovan handed me the datapad as the station shrank to a speck of light behind us. I broke the security seal and read the contents, and the world tilted underneath me. I had been reinstated to active military duty by direct order of Fleet Command. My rank was confirmed. My assignment was tactical liaison to Admiral Katrin Solin's battle group, effective immediately. And attached to my orders was a briefing document stamped with a classification level I had never encountered in my career. The document was titled Operation Redline. I read it during the 90-minute transit to the carrier group's forward staging position, and by the time I reached the final page, I understood everything. I understood the silence that had swallowed human space. I understood the disappearance of every ship and station and relay. I understood why the Conclave sensors could not count the contacts at the edge of their detection range, and I understood why no one in human command had answered any of the Conclave's communications. There was nothing to say. The time for words had ended in a chamber full of blood and silence. Operation Redline was not a battle plan. It was not a proportional response designed to restore balance and open the door to renewed negotiations. It was not a show of force intended to frighten the enemy back to the table. It was an annihilation doctrine, a 300-page blueprint for the complete and irreversible destruction of an enemy's capacity to wage war, written with the cold clarity of engineers solving a structural problem. Phase 1 had already been completed, while I sat in my cell counting the cracks in the ceiling. Human electronic warfare teams operating in stealth craft had located and neutralized 12 Conclave sensor relay stations across 4 sectors. The relays had not been destroyed. Destruction was loud. Destruction left debris fields and energy signatures that told the enemy where you had been and what you had done. Instead, the relays had been physically removed. Specialized cutting teams had detached the arrays from their mounting structures, loaded them onto cargo haulers, and carried them away. When Conclave repair ships arrived at the relay coordinates, they found empty space and clean-cut brackets where their sensor infrastructure used to be. The Conclave was partially blind. Their core detection capabilities remained, but their extended sensor net, the system that gave them early warning of threats approaching from deep space, had holes in it large enough to fly a fleet through, and they did not yet comprehend how much of the darkness around them was now filled with things they could no longer see. Phase 2 was the next step. I read the target list on my datapad and counted 314 entries. Every Conclave military shipyard across 5 sectors. Every fuel depot. Every ammunition reserve. Every maintenance facility. Dry dock. Weapons testing range. And forward supply base. Each target had been assigned a specific strike package. A tailored combination of ships and ordnance, calculated to destroy the facility with maximum speed and minimum collateral damage to surrounding civilian infrastructure. That phrase, minimum collateral damage, appeared on every page of the operational doctrine, underlined and cross-referenced with targeting protocols that specified approach angles, weapon yields, blast containment radii, and safe distances from civilian population centers, all calculated to the meter. The message embedded in every line of the plan was unmistakable. The destruction would be absolute, but it would be surgical. Civilians would not be harmed. The violence would be directed exclusively at the machinery of war and the people who commanded it. I looked up from the datapad as our shuttle decelerated into the formation perimeter of the fleet carrier Absolute Conviction. Through the forward viewport, I saw her for the first time. She was 3 kilometers long, a dark angular shape that blocked the stars behind her like a hole cut in the sky. She carried no navigation lights. Her hull was coated in sensor-absorptive material that made her nearly invisible against the background radiation of deep space. Around her, more shapes moved in the darkness, visible only as shadows that briefly occluded distant stars as they passed. Destroyers, cruisers, strike frigates, fast attack boats, troop transports, electronic warfare platforms, a fleet assembled in perfect silence, positioned in the void between star systems where no Conclave sensor could reach, waiting for the order that would set them in motion. Donovan saw my expression and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The fleet spoke for itself. Admiral Katrin Solin met me in the carrier's Combat Information Center. She was shorter than I had expected, a compact woman in her late 50s, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back from a face that had been weathered by decades of command. Her eyes were the kind that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything, including the 9-second recording of a massacre that she had watched 41 times. She told me that number herself. 41 times, she said. She had watched it 41 times, and she had ordered it played for every officer, every enlisted sailor, every Marine, every pilot in her battle group. She wanted every person under her command to see what had happened in that chamber. Not to inflame them, not to create rage, to ensure that every person who was about to go into action understood exactly what they were fighting for and exactly why. I asked her when Phase 2 would begin. She glanced at the tactical display that dominated the far wall of the CIC. It showed a vast 3-dimensional map of 5 sectors of space, populated with hundreds of blue icons representing human strike groups, each one positioned within striking distance of a Conclave military target. The icons pulsed softly, steadily, like heartbeats. She said, "It began 4 hours ago. The first wave had launched while I was still crawling through a maintenance shaft. The reports flowed into the CIC over the next 72 hours in a continuous stream, and I stood at the tactical display and watched them accumulate with a sensation in my chest that was not satisfaction and not grief, but something that lived in the space between those two things, occupying territory that neither word could fully claim. Shipyard Koreth 4, the largest military construction facility in the Conclave's northern sectors, was struck by a task force of 8 human destroyers. They emerged from faster-than-light travel at close range, inside the shipyard's defensive perimeter, and fired a synchronized salvo of guided munitions that struck every critical structural junction simultaneously. The shipyard, which had produced warships for the Conclave for 60 years, ceased to exist in under 120 seconds. A civilian habitat station, 400 meters from the shipyard's outer boundary, reported minor vibration from the shockwave. Every window intact. Every life support system nominal. Not a single civilian casualty. Fuel Reserve Station Peldara, which held enough stored antimatter to power the Conclave fleet for 3 years of continuous operations, was eliminated by a single human-heavy cruiser, firing from beyond the station's maximum detection range. The weapons officer placed the shot with a precision that the Conclave's own gunnery experts later described as theoretically impossible, rupturing the containment grid in a sequence that triggered a controlled annihilation reaction, consuming the fuel reserves, without generating a blast wave large enough to reach the nearest inhabited world, which was 11 light-minutes distant. Ammunition Depot Veshal, built inside an asteroid in one of the most heavily defended systems in Conclave space, was taken by a marine boarding team that penetrated the facility through an unmapped fissure in the asteroid's surface. They planted demolition charges on the magazine levels, systematically evacuated the 38 alien technicians who staffed the depot, confirmed that every non-combatant was at safe distance, and detonated the charges remotely. The asteroid cracked apart along its geological fault lines, and the ammunition reserves inside cooked off in a series of secondary explosions that turned the debris field into a brief and spectacular firework visible from 3 planets. 314 targets, 72 hours. The same pattern repeated across 5 sectors of space. Military facilities destroyed with overwhelming force and surgical accuracy. Civilian infrastructure preserved. Population centers untouched. The wreckage spoke a message that did not require translation. We can reach anything you have, anywhere you have it, at any time we choose. And we are choosing to destroy only the things you use to kill. Sothar ordered the combined Conclave fleet to mobilize on the second day of Phase 2. The mobilization encountered problems that became apparent within hours. Most of the fleet's logistical infrastructure no longer existed. Ships launched from their home ports with half-empty fuel cells because the depots that were supposed to top them off had been reduced to expanding gas clouds. Squadrons attempted to form up in designated rally points, but could not coordinate effectively because the sensor relay stations that were supposed to provide fleet-wide communications had been physically removed. Maintenance schedules collapsed. Supply chains evaporated. The military machine that was supposed to defend the Conclave discovered, all at once, that its bones had been pulled out while it was sleeping. The Velith flagship, a dreadnought named Mandate of Thresol, that was the largest warship in the Conclave Navy, assembled a battle group of 47 vessels and burned hard for the last known position of a human strike force in the Koreth sector. They arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. No ships, no energy signatures, no communications traffic, empty space. Then, 4,000 autonomous mines activated. The mines had been deployed by human stealth ships, days before the battle group's arrival. They were positioned in a 3-dimensional grid, calculated to cover every likely emergence point for a fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel. The targeting algorithms were simple and effective. Detect drive signatures, orient toward the nearest target, accelerate, detonate. 19 Conclave warships were destroyed in the first 60 seconds. The Mandate of Thresol survived because her captain had served long enough to develop instincts that overrode doctrine, and he slammed his engines into emergency reverse the moment the first mine detonated, pulling the massive dreadnought backward out of the kill zone before the expanding field of autonomous weapons could reach her. The surviving ships scattered in every direction, abandoning formation, abandoning coordination, abandoning each other in a desperate flight from a threat they could not see and could not fight. It was not a battle, it was a demonstration. On the third day of Phase 2, the Draenei Federation made its move. Their ambassador transmitted a public statement on every galactic communication frequency simultaneously. The Draenei were formally withdrawing from the Galactic Conclave. They declared strict neutrality in the conflict between humanity and the Council. They included a direct and public appeal to human military command, requesting non-aggression toward Draenei territory, assets, and citizens. The Corvani followed within 4 hours, then the Nelvori, 3 species, gone in a single day. The Conclave, which had numbered 14 members when Sothar gave the order that murdered 7 diplomats, was now down to 11 and shrinking. I stood on the bridge of the absolute conviction that evening, and watched the tactical board update in real time. Blue icons pulsed and blinked as strike groups reported their results. Over 60% of the Conclave's military infrastructure had been destroyed in 72 hours. Admiral Soline stood beside me. She had not slept in 2 days, and the fatigue showed in the lines around her eyes, and the careful deliberation with which she chose each word. But her posture was straight, and her voice was steady, and she watched the tactical display with the focused awareness of a woman who understood that her decisions would be studied and debated and judged for centuries after she was gone. She asked if I wanted to say something for the record. The ship's historian was documenting every significant moment of the operation, and Soline wanted my perspective as the senior surviving member of the diplomatic team that had been targeted. I touched the scar on my jaw. The tissue had healed poorly without proper medical treatment, and the skin along the ridge was tight and permanently numb. It ran from just below my right ear to the point of my chin, a pale line against my skin that I would carry for the rest of my life. Phase 3, I said. When? Soline checked the tactical display one final time. 48 hours, she said. I nodded and said nothing else. The dead were still dead, and the people who had killed them were about to discover what that cost. Sothar sent a private message to Human Command 36 hours before Phase 3 was scheduled to begin. I was standing in the CIC of the Absolute Conviction when the communication was received and decoded. It was the first time the Velith speaker had attempted direct contact with humanity since the day he ordered his troopers to fire, and the tone of the message was strikingly different from anything he had said publicly. The arrogance was gone. The condescension was gone. The language was careful, measured, stripped of rhetoric. He requested a ceasefire negotiation. He proposed neutral territory. He offered to discuss terms of mutual de-escalation. Admiral Soline read the message, forwarded it to Fleet Command on Earth, and received a reply in 11 minutes. The reply was a single word: no. That word was transmitted back to Sothar on the same channel he had used to contact us. No encryption, no diplomatic protocol, no invitation to counteroffer or rephrase or try again. Just the word, alone in the message field, final and complete. Within hours, the Conclave's remaining communication channels flooded with traffic from every direction. Every member species still aligned with the Council began transmitting ceasefire offers, apology statements, reparation proposals, and requests for dialogue on every frequency and through every channel they could access. The Torvathi offered financial compensation calculated to the precise economic value of each murdered diplomat's projected lifetime earnings, as though human lives could be reduced to a formula and paid off like a debt. The Yashiri offered to disband their own fleet contribution to the Conclave as a gesture of good faith. The Peldrani, who had maintained their characteristic silence throughout the massacre and its aftermath, suddenly discovered their capacity for speech and released a carefully worded statement expressing deep and sincere regret and calling for immediate negotiations. Every message was received by human communication officers. Every message was logged, catalogued, and filed. Not a single one was answered. I watched the incoming traffic on the communications board and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not pity. Just a flat, clear awareness that the species who had sat in perfect silence while 7 unarmed people were murdered in front of them were now learning what silence felt like from the other side. The Ilvari ambassador, a tall insectoid being whose species had voted in favor of Resolution 3117 without a moment of hesitation, delivered an emotional address to the remaining conclave members that I watched in recording afterward. He stood at the same podium where Osei had been shot, and he pleaded with Sothar to surrender unconditionally. He said the conclave could not win. He said every hour of continued resistance brought more destruction. He said pride was not worth the annihilation of 400 years of galactic governance. Sothar refused. He stood at the high bench in his ceremonial robes and declared that humans were overextended, that their logistics would collapse, that time and distance favored the conclave. He insisted that the pace of human operations would slow, that their industrial base could not sustain this level of military activity indefinitely, that patience and resolve would carry the day where firepower had failed. His own senior military officers no longer believed him. I learned after the war that 3 Velith fleet commanders had privately petitioned Sothahar to accept whatever terms humanity offered, warning him that continued resistance was suicidal. He dismissed all 3 from their positions and replaced them with officers whose primary qualification was their willingness to agree with whatever the speaker said. Phase 3 began at 0800 Standard Galactic Time. It was not what the Conclave expected. There were no more explosions, no more shipyards detonating in cascades of light, no more fuel reserves erupting. Phase 3 was not about destruction. It was about pressure applied so thoroughly and so patiently that the thing being squeezed had no choice but to collapse. Human forces established blockade perimeters around every major Council-affiliated star system. These were not traditional naval blockades, lines of warships sitting in visible formation, daring the enemy to challenge them. They were distributed networks of sensor platforms, weapons satellites, and fast-response patrol groups, positioned to monitor and control every approach vector to every Conclave core world. The coverage was total. Nothing entered. Nothing departed. Trade convoys were turned back. Resource shipments were diverted. Passenger vessels were rerouted to neutral ports. Military escorts were given a single verbal warning on an open channel, and then disabled by precision fire if they failed to comply. I oversaw blockade operations around Velith Prime from the CIC of the Absolute Conviction. My tactical displays showed the planet's orbital space as a grid of overlapping sensor coverage zones and weapons engagement arcs, every transit lane monitored, every potential departure vector sealed. The Velith still had their orbital defense platforms, massive weapon stations that bristled with guns and missile launchers. But those platforms required fuel, ammunition, replacement parts, food for their crews. The blockade did not need to destroy them. It just needed to wait until they ran dry. The first Velith military vessel to test the blockade was a frigate that burned hard for the perimeter, with weapons charged and shields at full power. A human patrol boat transmitted the standard automated warning. This system is under restricted access. Power down weapons and withdraw. The frigate did not comply. A human destroyer that had been running silent 18,000 kilometers away fired a single precision shot that severed the frigate's main engine housing from its hull, without breaching the crew compartments. The ship went dark and drifted, powerless but intact. A salvage team towed it to safe distance. No casualties. No one else tested the blockade. Within 1 week, the blockade's effects cascaded through the Conclave's remaining member systems with the inexorable force of gravity. Economies built on galactic trade collapsed as supply chains went silent. 2 member worlds, the Torvathi homeworld and a Yashiri colony, had been import-dependent for critical food supplies for decades. Their agricultural capacity had been allowed to atrophy as cheaper food from off-world suppliers made local production unnecessary. Their reserves hit critical levels within 6 days. Rationing was imposed. Civil unrest followed. 3 planets saw public demonstrations demanding that their governments break with the Conclave and negotiate independent peace agreements with humanity. On the Torvathi homeworld, the demonstrations turned into general strikes that shut down government services for 2 days until the Torvathi leadership issued a public statement distancing themselves from Sothar's policies. The Corvani, who had been questioning their Conclave membership since the day they abstained from the Resolution 31117 enforcement vote, held an emergency legislative session. The vote to formally expel their own Conclave delegation was decisive. The Corvani people had watched the systematic destruction of the Conclave's military capacity and the slow tightening of the blockade around every remaining member world, and they had made a collective decision that loyalty to the Council was not worth the starvation that continued resistance would bring. 2 more species followed the Corvani out within 48 hours. The Conclave, which had been 14 members strong when Sothar ordered his shock troopers to open fire, was reduced to 7, half its membership erased, half its political authority evaporated, and the blockade continued to tighten. On the 10th day of Phase 3, human command broke its silence. I was the one they chose to deliver the message, not a holographic projection, not an encrypted text communication, not an automated diplomatic transmission. A human being, standing in person, in the chamber where the blood had been spilled, speaking words that could not be ignored or distorted or edited into a version that suited the listener. I flew to the Conclave station aboard a diplomatic shuttle escorted by 6 heavy gunships that took up flanking positions around the station, with weapons hot and targeting systems active. The station's remaining defensive assets made no attempt to intercept. They did not have enough operational ships left to challenge 6 gunships, and the officers who commanded those ships knew it. I docked at the same port where our diplomatic mission had arrived months earlier. I walked through the same corridors, past the same junctions, past the detention block, where I had spent 11 days listening to alarms and watching bloodstains through a viewport. I wore my dress uniform, clean and pressed, with full rank insignia and the diplomatic mission patch on my left shoulder. The scar on my jaw was visible, and I had deliberately not sought cosmetic treatment for it. I wanted every being in that chamber to see what had been done, and to whom. The chamber was different, and it was not different. The architecture was the same, the high bench and the tiered seating and the central podium. But the tiered seating that had held 14 delegations now held 7, and several of those delegations consisted of a single representative sitting alone in a section designed for dozens. The room felt cavernous and empty and haunted. Sothar sat at the high bench in his ceremonial robes, flanked by his remaining allies, and he watched me walk to the podium with an expression that I could not decipher. It might have been contempt, it might have been fear, it might have been the look of a man who understood that history was about to pass judgment on him and could not decide whether to face it or flee. I stood at the same podium where Dara Osi had stood. I placed my hands on the same lectern. I looked at the stone floor, and I saw the dark stains that no one had cleaned, still there after all these weeks, darkened into the stone like shadows that would not fade. I read the terms. Full and immediate dissolution of the Galactic Conclave as a governing body. Unconditional surrender of all Velith military assets, including the remnants of their fleet, their orbital defense systems, and their planetary garrison forces. Extradition of Speaker Sothar and every officer involved in the planning and execution of the massacre for trial under human military law, with full legal representation and complete galactic transparency. Permanent reparations to the families of the 7 murdered diplomats, funded by seizure of Conclave governmental financial reserves. Formal recognition of humanity's sovereign right to independent military command, codified in a new multilateral charter that could not be overridden by any future governing body. I read these terms in a level voice without emphasis or emotion. The document said what it needed to say. It did not require performance. The chamber was silent when I finished. Not the silence of thought or consideration, the silence of people who understood that they were hearing the sound of their own political extinction and could not think of a single thing to say in response. Sothar stood. His hands gripped the edge of the bench, and his voice was controlled but tight, the words coming through clenched jaw muscles. He called the terms barbaric, disproportionate, imperial. He said that humanity had become the very existential threat he had warned the galaxy about, that our military response proved everything he had ever claimed about human aggression and ambition and willingness to use force as a tool of domination. I listened to every word. When he finished, I asked him calmly if he had anything else to say. He said he did not. I said, "Then Phase 4 begins at dawn." I turned from the podium and walked out of the chamber through the main entrance, past the spot where Daniel Farrow had been shot in the back, through the corridors and back to my shuttle. The gunships formed up around me, and we burned for open space. As the station shrank in the viewport behind me, I looked at it one final time. The seat of galactic governance for 400 years. The place where law was supposed to protect the innocent, and power was supposed to serve the collective good. I thought about Osei. I thought about the aides who died around her. I thought about every alien face in those tiered seats, watching, silent, motionless, complicit. I felt no guilt about what was coming next. Phase 4 began at 0600 Standard Galactic Time, and it was not a battle. A battle implies a contest, 2 forces meeting with uncertain outcome, each side fighting with the hope that skill or luck or determination might tip the balance. This was not that. This was one side systematically dismantling the other, with the careful, methodical precision of engineers decommissioning a condemned structure. Every remaining conclave military asset, every government command facility, every weapons factory, every orbital defense platform across all 7 remaining member systems was targeted simultaneously by human strike groups that had been in position for days, silent and dark, waiting in the void for a single command. The campaign lasted 14 hours. When it ended, the Conclave's capacity to wage war had been reduced to historical record. I spent those 14 hours in the CIC of the absolute conviction, standing at the tactical display beside Admiral Soline and her command staff, watching targets transition from active to destroyed, in a rolling cascade that swept across 5 sectors of space. The operations team processed incoming reports so rapidly that additional personnel had to be assigned to prevent the data from overwhelming the tracking systems. Every few minutes, another cluster of icons on the display would shift from red to gray, each transition representing a military installation that had existed for decades or centuries and now existed only as cooling debris. Velith Prime's orbital defense ring fell first. 6 battle stations, each one the size of a small city, arranged in geostationary orbit around the Velith homeworld. They were considered the most formidable fixed military installations in the galaxy, armed with weapons arrays that could engage targets across an entire star system and shielded by layered energy barriers that Velith engineers had publicly declared impenetrable. They fell in 90 minutes. Human electronic warfare ships opened the engagement from positions at the extreme edge of the defense ring's sensor envelope. They flooded the station's targeting systems with false contacts, phantom energy signatures, and corrupted tracking data that turned every gun on the ring against empty space. While the stations fired at threats that did not exist, bomber wings came in fast, through the resulting gaps in defensive coverage, delivering precision payloads that struck shield generators, power distribution nodes, and communications arrays in a carefully calculated sequence designed to collapse each station's ability to fight from the outside in. 4 stations were destroyed outright. The remaining 2 were boarded by Marine assault teams that breached through maintenance access ports and swept through the interior decks level by level. The fighting inside was brief. Velith garrison troops, who had trained for years to defend their stations against theoretical alien attackers, discovered that the reality of facing human Marines in close quarters was nothing like the simulations. The speed, the coordination, the ruthless efficiency with which the boarding teams cleared each compartment left no margin for organized resistance. Most Velith soldiers surrendered within minutes of contact. Those who chose to fight were subdued with non-lethal suppression systems that left them unconscious, but physically unharmed. The command station, the largest and most important of the 6, was captured intact. Its intelligence archives, its decades of communication logs, its operational planning databases, all of it seized by a human data exploitation team that began processing the information before the last Velith defender had been walked to a holding area in restraints. I was aboard that station within 2 hours of its capture, moving through corridors that smelled like burned circuits and fear, reviewing files that would serve as evidence in the tribunals to come. Across all 7 remaining Conclave member systems, the pattern was the same. Shipyards reduced to expanding debris fields by precision strikes that left civilian structures in adjacent orbital zones completely undamaged. Command bunkers beneath planetary surfaces, breached by tunneling charges, and cleared by ground teams who accepted surrenders from officers who had never expected to see human soldiers standing in their war rooms. Weapons factories demolished by guided munitions that collapsed their structures vertically, dropping them into their own foundations without touching the residential districts that surrounded them. Orbital platforms disabled, boarded, stripped of armament, and left drifting as empty husks. Power grids on every world remained operational. Water treatment systems continued to function. Hospitals were not touched. Communication networks stayed active, deliberately preserved so that civilian populations could share information, coordinate, and understand what was happening without relying on government channels that might distort the truth. The human military had drawn a line between the instruments of war and the people who lived under their shadow, and that line was absolute. The machinery of violence was being dismantled. The civilians it had claimed to protect were being left alone. The final act of Phase 4 was not a strike, it was a chase, and it ended before it properly began. Sothor attempted to flee Velith Prime 6 hours after the orbital defense ring collapsed. He had removed his ceremonial robes and dressed in civilian clothing, and he boarded a cargo vessel registered to a Peldrani trading company under false identity documents. The ship launched from a commercial port on the planet's far hemisphere, away from the main theater of military operations, and made a hard burn for the system's outer boundary at maximum acceleration. The human destroyer Cold Arithmetic, commanded by Captain Owen Price, intercepted the vessel before it cleared the upper atmosphere. Price's sensor officer had flagged the cargo ship's energy signature as inconsistent with its registered engine specifications. The vessel was running a military-grade power plant inside a civilian hull, and the mismatch was detectable to anyone who knew what to look for. It took Price's analysis team 4 minutes to match the power signature to a known Velith government vessel, and 3 minutes after that, the Cold Arithmetic maneuvered into the cargo ship's flight path and transmitted a single instruction: power down all systems and prepare to be boarded. Sothar did not resist. When the boarding team entered the cargo hold, they found him seated on a shipping crate with his hands resting in his lap, staring at the bulkhead opposite him. He did not speak. He did not invoke diplomatic immunity or legal protection. He did not protest or negotiate, or demand to know by what authority he was being detained. He sat in silence and waited to be taken. I met him in the brig of the Absolute Conviction 3 hours later. The Marine guards opened the cell door, and I stepped inside and stood across from the being who had ordered the murder of 7 people I had known and respected and served alongside. He was smaller than I remembered. In the conclave chamber, elevated on the speaker's platform and draped in the robes of his office, surrounded by the architecture of power and the weight of centuries of tradition, Sothar had been an imposing figure. In a bare metal cell aboard a human warship, stripped of his robes and his guards and his authority, he was just a tired alien with gray skin and flat eyes, sitting on a cot that was too short for his frame. He asked me what would happen to him. His voice was quiet and oddly conversational, as though we were acquaintances meeting in a corridor, rather than a war criminal facing his captor. I told him the truth. There would be a trial. Evidence would be presented. All of it, including my unedited ocular recording of the massacre. Defense counsel would be provided, from among his own species if he wished, and given full access to every piece of evidence the prosecution intended to use. The proceedings would be broadcast on every galactic communication network that could carry the signal, so that every species in the galaxy could watch and judge for themselves. Due process, I said. Legal representation, transparent proceedings, a verdict based on evidence examined in the open. Everything that 7 murdered diplomats were never given. He looked at me for a long moment, then his gaze moved to the scar on my jaw, the pale ridge of tissue that ran from my ear to my chin, and something shifted in his expression that I could not interpret. It might have been recognition. It might have been something else entirely. He did not apologize. He did not express regret. He nodded once, slowly, and turned his face toward the wall. I left the brig and walked through the carrier's corridors to the observation deck at the top of the ship. Through the viewport, Velith Prime hung in the blackness below, its cities still illuminated, its infrastructure intact, its population alive. The orbital defense ring was dark wreckage drifting in decaying orbits that would eventually carry the debris into the atmosphere, where it would burn up as streaks of light across an alien sky. The military installations on the planet's surface were smoking craters, but the world itself was whole. The people who lived there would wake up tomorrow in a civilization that no longer possessed the power to threaten anyone. But they would wake up. Their children would go to school. Their hospitals would function. Their water would flow. The conclave dissolved 3 days later, in a vote held in the same chamber where the massacre had taken place. The motion to dissolve the governing body passed unanimously. It was, as far as historians could determine, the first unanimous vote in the conclave's 400-year existence. The irony was not lost on anyone. The chamber was sealed after the vote. It would be preserved as a historical site, maintained in exactly the condition it was in at the time of the dissolution. The bloodstains on the floor, the scorch marks on the walls. The podium, still bearing the crack where a plasma bolt had struck the stone inches from where Osei had been standing. all of it left in place as a record of what had happened, what it had cost, and what it had unleashed. In the weeks that followed, 23 species sent formal communications to humanity. Some were apologies, carefully drafted and vetted by teams of diplomats and legal advisors. Some were requests for bilateral treaties, practical arrangements between individual civilizations and the human government, to replace the multilateral framework that the conclave had provided. Some were simple acknowledgments that the old order had ended, and that something new would need to be built in its place. The Draenei, who had withdrawn from the conclave before the first shot of the war was fired, and whose ambassador had been the only voice to warn Sothar of the consequences of his actions, proposed a new multilateral forum, not a council with binding authority, not a governing body that could override the sovereign decisions of its members. A forum with rotating leadership, transparent procedures, and no mechanism by which any species or coalition could strip another of its fundamental rights. They proposed that humanity co-lead the founding process alongside 3 other species. Humanity's response was cautious and deliberate. The diplomats who had been appointed to replace Ose and her murdered team engaged with the Draenei proposal with the careful attention of people who understood that the precedent being established would echo through galactic politics for generations. The underlying message was never explicitly stated, but was understood by every species who heard it. Cooperation is welcome. Coercion will be answered. The trial of Sothar and 11 Velith military officers began 4 months after the dissolution of the conclave. It was held before a joint tribunal composed of human judges and independent legal observers from 9 alien species who had volunteered to participate. The proceedings were broadcast live on every galactic communication network, and the viewership estimates suggested that more sentient beings watched the trial than had ever watched any single event in the recorded history of the galaxy. I testified on the first day. I sat in a chair facing the tribunal panel, and I told them everything. The political maneuvering that preceded the massacre, the vote, the override of the sovereign charter, the signal, the troopers moving into firing positions, the first shot, Ose falling, Calloway hit in the back, Grant thrown against the wall, Pharaoh killed at the door. The smell of plasma discharge, sharp and metallic, filling the chamber like a chemical announcement of death. The sound of bodies hitting stone. And the silence. The absolute comprehensive silence of 14 alien delegations, watching it happen and choosing to do nothing. I told it in a flat, steady voice. I did not pause for effect. I did not add commentary or interpretation. I stated facts in the order they occurred, and I let the facts carry their own weight. They were heavy enough without my help. Then they played my recording. The 9-second burst transmission that I had punched through the conclave station's jamming net, while Velith troopers closed in around me. It was displayed on a screen visible to every person in the tribunal chamber, and simultaneously broadcast to every species watching across the galaxy. The recording was not edited. It was not enhanced or stabilized or processed in any way. It was raw first-person footage captured through my ocular implant, shaky with adrenaline and movement, chaotic with the sounds of weapons fire and falling bodies. It showed the chamber from my perspective. It showed the troopers raising their weapons. It showed the first bolt hitting Ose. It showed the aides falling around her. It showed the blood spreading across stone that had been polished smooth by 4 centuries of diplomatic footsteps. And it showed the faces of the alien delegations, row upon row of them, sitting in their elevated seats, watching the murder of 7 unarmed human beings, with expressions ranging from shock to discomfort to careful, studied neutrality. The tribunal chamber was silent when the recording ended. I counted the silence. It lasted 11 seconds. Sothar was convicted on all charges. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty on every count. He was sentenced to permanent confinement in a secure facility on a neutral world, selected by the tribunal and monitored by a joint security force drawn from multiple species. The 11 Velith officers who had participated in the planning and execution of the massacre received individual sentences ranging from 30 years to life, calibrated to their specific roles and the degree of their involvement. Sothar received his sentence without visible reaction. He stood when it was read. He listened to the full text. and he was escorted from the chamber by guards who handled him with more care and more respect than his own troopers had shown to the people they killed. I watched him walk out, and I never saw him again. 6 months after the trial, a memorial was constructed on the conclave station. It was placed in the exact spot where Ambassador Dara Ose had fallen, inside the sealed chamber that had been preserved since the dissolution vote. The chamber was opened for the dedication ceremony, and then sealed again, permanently, with the memorial inside. 7 pillars of dark stone, each 2 meters tall, arranged in a circle at the center of the chamber floor. Each pillar bore the name, rank, service dates, and homeworld of one of the 7 diplomats who had died. The stone was quarried from Earth, transported across the galaxy, and placed by hand by a team of human engineers who worked in silence for 3 days to ensure that every pillar was perfectly positioned and perfectly level. At the center of the circle, carved into the stone floor in galactic common script so that any species in the galaxy could read it without translation, was a single phrase: "We remember, and we answer." I attended the dedication. I stood in front of Ose's pillar for a long time, longer than the ceremony required, longer than the other attendees expected. I read her name carved into dark stone, and I thought about the last time I had seen her alive, standing at the podium, back straight, voice steady, hands resting on the lectern, believing, with every fiber of her being, in law and reason and the fundamental decency of civilized beings. She had been wrong about the conclave. She had been wrong about the willingness of powerful institutions to respect the rules they themselves had written. But she had not been wrong about humanity. She had not been wrong about what we would do when someone crossed the line that every species draws around its own. I retired from military service 2 years after the war ended. I had been offered promotions, operational commands, advisory positions at the highest levels of fleet planning. I declined all of them. I had done what was necessary when it was necessary, and I had done it without hesitation or regret. But I was tired in a way that no rank or title or position of authority could address. It was the tiredness of a man who had seen the machinery of civilization stripped down to its raw components, and understood that beneath the protocols and the treaties, and the diplomatic language, the only thing that ultimately mattered was the willingness to act, when acting was the only option left. I took a teaching position at the Diplomatic Academy on Earth. I taught a course on interspecies negotiation and conflict resolution, which several of my former colleagues found ironic, given my personal history. But I believed then, and I believe now, that the most effective teachers of diplomacy are those who have witnessed firsthand what happens when diplomacy fails. Theory is valuable. Experience is irreplaceable. On my first day in the classroom, I faced 32 students who had studied the Conclave War in their preparatory coursework and had read my testimony from the tribunal transcripts. They looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, because I was not a hero. I was a survivor who had done his job under circumstances that should never have existed. And the distinction between those two things mattered to me, even if it did not matter to them. A student in the front row raised her hand. She was young, perhaps 22, with the earnest and open expression of someone who still believed that understanding history could prevent the future from repeating its worst chapters. She asked me what the most important lesson of the Conclave War was. I thought about it. Not for long. The answer had been living inside me for years, fully formed, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I touched the scar on my jaw, the ridge of pale tissue that ran from my ear to my chin, the mark I had carried every day since the morning the universe changed. Every species in the galaxy has a line, I said. Ours is written in the blood of our own. Cross it, and no force in the universe will save you from the answer. The classroom was silent. 32 young faces looked at me, and I looked back at them, and in the quiet between us, I could feel the weight of everything that had been lost, and everything that had been built from the wreckage, and everything that had been learned at a price that should never have been paid. Then I opened my textbook, and I began the first lecture. Some lessons can only be taught by the people who live them,